Christian parenting. I'm Julie Lyles Carr. You're listening to the All Mom Does podcast, part of the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Today on the All Mom Does podcast, I'm your host, Julie Lyles Carr. Dr. Donna Lane is with me. I know this is going to be such a valuable conversation because she is a marriage and family therapist. She and her husband are a husband-wife counseling duo, and she has lots of insight on what we're seeing now that the pandemic has gone on a lot longer than we would have thought, and what that means for our kids, because there definitely is impact when it comes to our kiddos. Dr. Donna Lane, thanks so much for being with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to a great conversation, and hopefully we can shed some light on some things that are going on and even make some suggestions about things that can help.
Absolutely. So give me a little bit of your background. How did you decide to go into marriage and family counseling and to get into this line of work?
Well, I actually stumbled into it. I was taking a child development course where I went to school. And I was taking it because I was taking organic chemistry and calculus and 2 or 3 other big science classes, and I thought it was going to be an easy A. And so I signed up for it for that reason, but fell in love with it. As soon as I got in the class, everything was just fascinating to me, and I felt in my spirit that this was my calling. So goodbye organic chemistry, hello psychology. So that's how I got into it. And then my first job was working actually in a psychiatric hospital, providing counseling for children and adolescents who were inpatients in the hospital.
You know, I feel like when it comes to the topic of kids, we don't always look to psychology and psychiatry in terms of children, except for this. I think we often look to those in those fields to say, is my child developing quote unquote normally? What are the milestones and the thresholds I should be looking for? We don't often think about the very real situation that is mental illness in children. And, you know, you provided a really interesting statistic that pre-COVID, we were seeing 1 in 6 kids between the ages of 6 and 17 having a mental health diagnosis. And of course, this was prior to the pandemic. That's a significant number. And I have a sense that it's probably looking even more urgent now. What are you seeing now that we are this many months into the pandemic when it comes to mental health in kids?
Well, we are seeing an increase in stress-related disorders like anxiety, depression, also seeing an increase in teenagers in suicide, which is frightening. So we are seeing an impact. And some of that has to do with, of course, the environment being so restrictive and limiting to kids. One of the most important things that kids need for quote-unquote normal development, if you want to call it that, is the opportunity to explore and to feel like they have a purpose and that they're fulfilling their purpose, and they're trying to figure out the question of what's their identity, who are they going to be. Each of these things is affected by the fact that they have limited social contact, because many of those things have to do with social relationships. Their peer relationships are being changed radically. And the other thing that I have seen is that they're relying more and more. Now, of course, this is a problem anyway. And part of the reason that we're seeing the statistics we're seeing before the pandemic, but we're seeing more and more screen time.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And as the kids spend so much time on a screen, it's squelching their imagination. And if you think about it, if we don't develop an imagination, we can't develop the ability to problem solve, because it requires us being able to imagine potential solutions before we can solve a problem. It also impacts how we figure out what the consequences are going to be for our actions. And so kids that struggle with development of imagination oftentimes also struggle with impulse control, because they don't understand or recognize, they can't imagine, in other words, the consequences of their actions until the consequences are on them, and then they're surprised and saying, oh, I didn't know.
I had no idea.
Yeah. So the significant impact of all of the screen time is going to be felt across many different areas of child development, unfortunately. So one of the first things I would recommend is, given that so much screen time is required for school, cut off screen time after that, with the exception of allowing them to interact with their peers in a face-to-face forum.
Right.
Like on Skype.
Right. That's been the social aspect for particularly my twins who are 13. That's been the way that they primarily have been able to interact with friends through that venue.
Not so much video games, not so much TV time, trying to limit the other screen time that doesn't provide socialization.
Right. I think you're so right. That place and that value that imagination needs to have for all of us. I think sometimes we think that imagination is the provenance of 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds, playing with their toys, but it's so good for all of us, and its direct application to problem solving. That's really a great thing to be paying attention to. One thing that you've written is everyone is suffering with some form of mental health issue during COVID, and that we're especially concerned with kids. Unpack that for me, that you believe that everyone is struggling with something during this time. What does that look like to you?
Well, circumstances affect how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about our life, basically. And the fact that our circumstances are being limited, our choices are being limited, that directly impacts my response to stress. Because one of the reasons that anxiety starts developing is people believe that they have to, meaning that their choices are limited in some way, or they can't. Again, limited choices. So we begin to feel powerless and trapped, and as a result, anxiety is the natural consequence of feeling powerless and trapped. So a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, the social isolation leads to depression, and you don't have to be diagnosable for these things to affect you. You can have depressed feelings, you can have anxiousness, nervousness, you can have it impact your sleep because you're not getting enough activity or stimulation in your day. And these are all things that affect our mental health.
Right. You've also talked about that to some level, a lot of us are processing grief. And I have those people in my world who might not exactly see some of the things they've experienced during the pandemic as a grief process, but they would acknowledge there's been loss. For others, part of what I think we sometimes compare with that's very interesting. For example, one of my kids got married March 1st, right before the pandemic, had the wedding they planned, all the things. Another one of my kids got married August 1st. And of course, Donna, we thought it was going to be completely done by August, right? and it was very different. Right. It was a very different wedding than what we had planned. Here's what's interesting. Of course, we have such gratitude that my daughter was able to get married, that we were able to pull off what we were able to pull off. There's a tremendous amount of gratitude there, and that's important. But there was also having to let go of what we had thought was going to be. And then sometimes you can have this weird sense of, but how can we possibly complain? There's so much worse going on right now. There are people who are experiencing really significant losses. And essentially we were dealing with the inconvenience of having to do a pandemic wedding. How do we collate all that and give the appropriate amount of attention and healing to places where we've really had to divert and change things up in a significant way without getting too far over in the ditch and not recognizing where there have been blessings?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that grief is a unique and individualistic process for everyone, and that there are different kinds and levels of grief. That doesn't mean that the grief for the loss of the wedding that she wanted is any less important than the grief of the loss of a loved one. It's just different. And so as long as we give ourselves permission to feel the feelings that we're having and to embrace that something was lost there, that was significant to your family, to your daughter, that that it's okay to embrace that and recognize the significance of that loss, while at the same time recognizing that someone's going through the loss of a parent or the loss of a child or the loss of a spouse is going through a totally different kind of grief, a totally different level of loss, and allow them also the feelings that they're having, the individual and very unique feelings that they're having. When you lose an individual, that relationship that you had with that person is a one-of-a-kind relationship. Nobody else has that exact relationship. Nobody knows what it feels like to you to lose that person, for that significant other space to be gone from your space. And so to allow people the ability to grieve as they are grieving, no matter what the cause of the loss is, give them encouragement, show up for them, be there by their side and with them, and acknowledge it. That's the first thing. If we tell ourselves, oh, my loss doesn't matter, then all we're doing is squashing our feelings down somewhere deep inside, and they're going to show up somewhere else because feelings demand to be dealt with. So as far as I'm concerned, we might as well deal with them and bring them out in the open.
Right.
Still recognizing that there are different kinds of loss, and accepting at the same time any gratitude that you might have for the fact, as you said, that your loss maybe is not as significant as someone who has lost their spouse.
Right. Or if we're a situation where there's been a job loss, or,
Right.
a significant event where, there wasn't a workaround. It had to be completely canceled, those kinds of things.
Right.
Absolutely. I've been hearing a phrase batted around that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, and that is Coronaphobia. And the idea being that we've been in this lane for such a long time that for people to be able to reemerge in ways that are safe and are thoughtful, but they may find themselves feeling guilty if they decide to have that distanced coffee with a friend. They may find themselves feeling really upset or anxious by going into the grocery store and there are a lot of people there. So first of all, what do you think about this notion of something like a coronaphobia, and what does this mean? How does this inform that as things begin to open up in the next few months, which we're hoping they will, but what are the odds that we may find ourselves? I know there are going to be those people who are ready, like they don't care. They're not going to feel the least bit nervous about anything opening back up. But for those people who have really been playing it safe and who have really been concerned about the outcomes that they're seeing, how is that going to inform what their reemergence is like?
Well, I can see the potential, and have already seen with some of the clients that I work with, agoraphobia showing up, the
Right.
unwillingness to come out of the house at all. And even when things are safe, even when they can be reassured, hey, you're just going to the park, nobody's going to be there, you're going to be in this space by yourself, don't get anywhere near anybody else, you'll be fine, and they still don't want to go out. I've already seen that happening. I can see that happening in some numbers once everybody starts emerging from hiding, so to speak.
Right.
There's kind of a sense of, I guess, safety that goes along with feeling cocooned in your home. And people that are extroverts are going to be those ones that are going to be saying, oh gosh, get me out of here. I've got to be around other people. I've got to get some energy from life. I can't be here anymore. And then there's those, and I'm one of them, those introverts that are going to be much more likely to be comfortable staying at home and just kind of get used to it. I've heard some people talk about, well, I don't see any reason to go back to work. I'll just stay and work from home. I just won't ever be around anybody.
Right.
So I think that's a real phenomenon.
Right. And, I do think that personality style plays into it. And I think what your life was prior to the pandemic versus how it might have adjusted. For myself, I am one of those people who I call myself an ambivert, because I can get out and do the thing and be on stage and all the things, but I really am, my tank really is refilled by being alone. And I certainly do my best work when I can get in a flow, when I don't have a lot of interruption, where I don't have a lot of social expectation of people dropping into the office or anything like that. So for a number of years, my life has been more organized around a work from home type habit. And then I am married to the world's biggest extrovert.
That's got to be a challenge.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. He actually just won a few months ago. He was named the Toastmaster International World Champion of Speaking, and he had to do it from a virtual perspective, somebody who loves to be on the stage and interact with all the people who come to those type of events. And it was housed down into a virtual event. And so I am very fascinated on the other side of this. For me, when the pandemic hit, certainly there were things that changed, but a lot of my workflow in terms of the majority of my work week was not radically different. For my husband, things were very different. For two of my adult kids who teach dance and who are professional dancers, their professional lives have changed a lot. So I think you're right. It's going to be interesting to see how personality style and work preference style plays into how people feel on the other side. Do you think we may see that with some kids? Because the reality is we have extroverts and introverts in the traditional classroom, and kids who I know we've got a lot of kids we're concerned about who the learning cycle has not seemed to be as effective for them. It's been really difficult. But then I also know of kids who've actually done pretty well and have really liked this. So what happens then when we go back out into the world?
Well, there's been some conversations, at least in my area of the country, about maintaining kind of an optional mixed format instead of going back to all in class. And I don't know if that's going to come to pass, who knows, but that conversation has been going on because of what you're describing, which some kids really flourishing in an environment where they can work without the stimulation of all the other kids around them, or do better really self-directed. But then you've also got the kids that do not do well at all, and my concern is what I'm seeing with kids that are fundamentally missing a year of school because they're really not learning anything from doing the work without the direct contact with the teacher. And of course, the relationships that the teachers develop with the kids is also a loss for those kids because the relationships that they develop online are not the same as face-to-face. So they're missing out that. Going back to that idea of exploration, school for elementary age kids is their primary place of exploration, and that's being taken away from them. So I see that having a significant impact.
Right. It's going to be so fascinating. I think we'll be studying it for many years to take a look at how all these things converge and play, the lessons we learn, the things that we decide to carry forward, the things that we are glad are far behind. You know, I think one thing that is interesting to me is it's not easy necessarily to know when a kid is actually wrestling with depression. You have those kids who might have that vocabulary or that ability to identify what's going on, but a lot of kids, that's not how it's going to show up. What are 5 things we can be looking for, 5 symptoms that can indicate that we might have a kid who's wrestling with some depression symptoms?
Well, the first one I would say to look for is unusual or unexplained anger. For kids, often depression shows up first as anger rather than sadness. That's not always the case, but it can be. So if your child is not usually an angry kid, and all of a sudden they're snappish and have severe outbursts and tantrums and things like that, that's a red flag. Another is a loss of interest in things that they usually really enjoy. And I'm not talking about, I'm sick of soccer. I'm talking about, I don't really feel like doing anything. I'm hibernating in my room. I want to be left alone. I just don't feel like doing anything.
Right.
Another is regression, going back to earlier developmental stages. Maybe younger kids pick up a toy that they have left behind that they slept with, or a blanket that they used to cuddle, and they pick that back up again, or they get clingy with their parents and start asking to sleep in bed with them. Really kind of childishness in a little bit older kids that's unusual for the child. That's another thing to look for. Obviously, withdrawal is a significant issue for kids that are depressed. So if they become socially isolated, even worse than COVID is causing, which again goes back to the idea that COVID is significantly increasing depression.
Right.
But that social isolation, that withdrawal where they don't want to interact with people they usually interacted with, where they want to be away from even their family members, that's a sign. And then the last one I would say is definitely something that requires intervention is if they begin to do self-harming behavior, whether that's risk-taking behavior or cutting or any kind of self-harm. You want to address that immediately.
If parents are seeing these things showing up with their kids, I know that it would seem that the next logical step is to try to find a counselor, to try to find a therapist to intervene in that way. But what should we be looking for in terms of someone to help us in a situation like that? Because, not all of those situations are created equal. So how do we determine who would be a best fit?
Well, I would look for any counselor or therapist who specializes in working with children. It is a specialty area. And just because somebody has had a class at college in working with children doesn't mean that they specialize in it. So look for somebody that knows what they're doing with kids. In particular, depending on the age of your child, looking for a play therapist for younger kids, a certified play therapist, a registered play therapist, and making sure that the person has a good experience. It's also a good idea to choose a therapist that is similar in faith with you, because faith ends up being a very powerful aspect of healing. And more research is showing that incorporating faith into counseling is actually very beneficial. So you don't want your therapist to be of a different faith. If you can find one that matches your particular beliefs, that would be better. And someone that the child can relate to. You might have to do some shopping, meaning take the child to interact with 2 or 3 different people and see who they best relate to, because it is about forming a relationship with that therapist and allowing the therapist to get to know the child well. And if the child doesn't feel comfortable, they won't open up.
Right. Donna, speak to this. I know we have parents who are wanting to do right by their kids. They're wanting to pay attention to that signaling that you talked about that could be showing that kids are struggling with a depression cycle or are really having a lot of anxiety surrounding the events and the times in which we're living. But we have moms and dads who are exhausted, and we're seeing
Absolutely.
A lot of stuff coming out, particularly surrounding a lot of women where they are really feeling the crush of the work from home, running the school, trying to keep the household together on top of all the things. How do we engage in the self-care in such fraught times so that we can be there to pay attention when our kids are really struggling? Because, when we start having struggles ourselves, it can be awfully hard to raise our heads and really recognize what's going on with our kids sometimes.
In fact, that's one of the first things that I tell parents who call me and say, well, what do I need to do? What can I do? Is I say, you've got to look in the mirror first. You've got to see how are you dealing with your response to all of these changes in the environment. And you're exactly right. It's oftentimes falling to the moms to manage the school and the home and work. And that's impossible. It's an impossible task. So looking at your responses, looking at what you're believing, are you telling yourself that you have to do it all? And if you are, then change that language and give yourself permission to not be perfect. Give yourself permission to let things slide. So what if your home is not pristine? Nobody's going to look sideways at that. And so what if you have to maybe leave work a little bit early or put work down for a little while because your kid needs you? Do what you need to do based on your own values. And then make sure that when you do have the opportunity, maybe before your child gets up in the morning or after they go to bed at night, make sure that you do the things that you know feeds your soul, the things that help you to feel relaxed, at peace, whether that's prayer or just relaxing in a bath or taking a walk, doing anything that helps you to feel more yourself. And even some things that you can do that you can involve your kids in doing it with you. You need to clean up the kitchen. Your kids need to feel like they have a purpose. So combine those two things and say, okay, you come in here, I need your help. Come in here and let's work on cleaning this counter together. Let me stand you on a stool and you can hand me the dish soap every time I need it, or you can wipe down the dishes and put them away for me. And so then your task and their needs are both getting handled at the same time. Or maybe your self-care is to go take a walk. Well, say you want to go take a walk with me. And now you're spending time with your child at the same time that you're taking care of your needs.
Right.
So try to combine things in a way that is beneficial to you. But the main thing I would say is grace, grace, grace. Give yourself plenty of grace and understanding that these are unprecedented times. Really, in our lifetime, we've never seen anything like this. So let's try to be kind to each other and to ourselves.
Absolutely. You know, we're all learning how to parent
Yes.
during a pandemic. Nobody can be the expert in this moment because nobody's
That's right.
done it. And so there is a lot of improv. And I think that message of grace is so, so vital. You have talked about a silver lining when it comes to COVID and mental health. I am really interested to hear you unpack that for me. What is the silver lining when it comes to COVID and our mental health?
Well, truthfully, for me, the silver lining is the development of resilience in our kids.
Right.
Children have a tremendous amount of resilience naturally, and if they are given the right environment and encouragement, then they can be flexible and handle a lot of things. It's amazing to watch kids who go through horrible situations and how amazingly well adjusted they end up being. It's quite miraculous just because they are resilient. Well, the more resilience your kids develop, the better off they are in handling difficulty throughout their lives. So to me, that's one of the great silver linings, is that we're teaching our kids, if we do a good job with them at this point, we're teaching our kids how to handle difficulty, how to be flexible. Another one is that we have the opportunity for a lot of time, FaceTime with our kids, a lot of one-on-one, just being together time. And that attachment and bonding is one of the keys to healthy development. So in the past, maybe mom and dad are both away at work until 6 o'clock at night, and they come home and all they have time for with their kids is a meal and homework and bath and bed. And now, one or maybe both of the parents are at home with the child all day, potentially. And even if they are doing their job and the child is doing their schoolwork, but y'all are in proximity, that connection is still being built and developed from that. So I think that's actually a silver lining, although I know a lot of moms would say, "Oh my gosh, please give me some space. Let me get my child back to school." But there is really good in making those secure relationships, the kind of relationships they form with their parents when they are children become reflected in the relationships they form as adults.
Right, right. So it's so great to hear that even though they may be hard-earned silver linings, that they are there, and to be
Yes.
aware that there are going to be some great outcomes that come from all of this too, because we've lived through this with our kids. Well, Dr. Donna Lane, I just can't thank you enough for being here. I know that your insights and your specific areas where you're able to tell us, hey, be on the lookout for this and celebrate that and give yourself some grace, so helpful in these times. Sure appreciate you, and thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
You'll find more from this episode on the show notes. Be sure and check them out at allmomdoes.com. And wanted to ask you a big favor, be sure and go to wherever you are listening to this podcast and give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps us get the word out about the podcast. Can't wait to see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.